I'm going to show you basically how the movie business and how movie theater design played out in mid-century Minneapolis and St. Paul. But in order to understand what happened in the movie business during that era, the middle part of the 20th century, I think it probably behooves us to go back a little bit in time, back further, just before the turn of the 20th century, understand sort of the context of how we got to that point in the mid-century. The first movies, here and pretty much everywhere, were shown on basically makeshift canvas screens that were thrown up in existing theaters like this one. This is the Bijou. It was near the corner of Hennepin and Washington in downtown Minneapolis, pretty much where the Whole Foods is now, if you can picture that. This wasn't the first theater in the Twin Cities to show motion pictures, but it was pretty close. In 1896, there were about 200 people that packed this place. They gathered to watch a film that was called Persimmon Winning the Derby. And that was a film that showed a horse race in England. And at the time, it was one of the biggest, most famous races of all time. And the audience members who went into the Bijou at this time were stunned because, you know, if you think about it, these people had never seen an event replayed in front of their own eyes. I mean, we're used to that happening all the time, probably every other minute in our lives, but this was a completely new thing. And this is what happened at the Bijou in 1896. So the Bijou and other older theaters like it were this type of theater, an existing theater that was used for live performances where people went to see the earliest motion pictures. Okay, so that's the first type of theater that really was part of the movie scene in the Twin Cities and elsewhere. The next one, during the first few years of the 1900s, new form of entertainment, vaudeville, is starting to catch on. And vaudeville was basically a kind of cleaned up and repackaged version of the variety shows that had been popular for many years. You know, they had animal acts and musicians and magicians, and contortionists and all sorts of things, almost anything, any kind of act you can think of. And people start building theaters specifically for vaudeville, and this is one of them. This is Minneapolis's first Orpheum Theater, not the one that we have now, but the first one. It was located on 7th Street. And it wasn't long before the vaudeville circuits, like Orpheum, figured out that they could include motion pictures as part of their shows. So that's what they did. The vaudeville theaters, like the Orpheum, and like in Minneapolis, there was also an Orpheum in St. Paul. They became that second type of theater to show movies in the Twin Cities. And it wasn't long after that that individuals, people, not big entertainment companies like Orpheum, started looking to cash in on this new form of entertainment. And this is when you start seeing storefront theaters, or what became known as Nickelodeons. This is the Mazda Theater on Hennepin Avenue in downtown Minneapolis. It was a storefront, along with many other of these smaller ones on Hennepin and elsewhere. In many cases, these are just what you'd expect, little retail establishments converted into basically makeshift movie theaters with rows of wooden chairs and screens made of bed sheets and canvas and whatnot. They weren't very comfortable, and the quality of the pictures was usually quite horrible, but you know, at least they were cheap. And so this was where a lot of people got their first taste of the movies in the storefronts, in the Nickelodeons. But nearly every big city in the country, there was someone out there usually who was convinced that movies were the next big thing, and they were willing to sink some real money into building nice, comfortable theaters that were made specifically for showing movies. And in the Twin Cities, there were two men who had that vision, and they started building a chain of these types of early movie theaters. Their names were Moses Finkelstein and Isaac Rubin. And this is one of their first theaters, called the Palace on Hennepin Avenue. It was next door to where the Gay 90s is. right now on Hennepin. It was huge for the time, 2,400 seats. I mean, compared to these storefront theaters, it was almost unbelievable. But despite its size, this particular theater, the Minneapolis Palace, was never really all that architecturally special. It was just one of the biggest of this first generation of Finkelstein and Rubin theaters, and it never rose to the level of what would be the next category of movie theaters that appeared in the Twin Cities, and those were the picture palaces. These were immense, elaborate sort of caverns where you could take your seat and get lost in movie magic. And this is one of them. You may recognize it, although it looks a little bit different today. This is the State Theater on Hennepin, which of course survives to this day, even though it's no longer a movie theater per se. Now, the definition of picture palaces is sort of pliable, but as far as I'm concerned, the Twin Cities had 3 of them. The first one was called the Capitol. It was in downtown St. Paul. It was an incredible show house, but the other 2 were in downtown Minneapolis. There was the State, and that was the first one. It opened in 1921, and it had 2,400 seats like the Palace, the one that I just showed you, but the State was much more lavish in comparison. The other picture palace in the Twin Cities was this one, the Minnesota. It was at 9th and LaSalle in downtown. And it was by far the most magnificent of the 3. It opened in 1928. The Minnesota was really the crown jewel of all the theaters in the Twin Cities at the time. It seated more than 4,000 people. So you think about it, this State, which was big enough, held 2,400. This was, more than half again as large. Its lobby was bigger than most movie theaters were. And it wasn't just the place, the physical presence, it was the way the moviegoers were treated at the Minnesota as well, almost like royalty. The Minnesota kept this huge staff that was always on the job. It even had one employee whose one job was to change light bulbs. That's how big this place was. In 1944, in case you're not familiar with this, you may be familiar with what it became, what it was renamed. It was called the Radio City, and for a number of years it was known as the Radio City. But it was eventually demolished in 1958, and it turned into a parking deck. So that was the big development in movie exhibition in the 1920s, the opening of the construction of these big picture palaces. Now we come to a little blip in history of movie theater design, but it's worth mentioning, especially here in the Twin Cities. In the mid to late 1920s, there's a new fad, and it doesn't last too long. It's called the atmospheric style. And the Twin Cities had 2 of these theaters, and this is one that you might be familiar with. When it opened in 1928, it was called the Granada, but you might know it by its other name, the name that it still is today, the Suburban World. It stands in the uptown area, Hennepin and Lake, that area. The whole idea of the atmospheric theaters was to create the illusion that you were sitting in an elegant outdoor garden watching a movie, and often there's a fake sky above you with twinkling lights and a roving moon that moves during the course of the movie. That's what the Granada had. And the other atmospheric theater, by the way, in the Twin Cities was the Uptown, not the one that's in the uptown area of Minneapolis, but the Uptown in St. Paul, I believe on Grand Avenue. It closed in 1976. So even though this is a very short-lived fad, the Twin Cities did get in on this national trend. This theater, by the way, was designed by a guy named Jack Liebenberg, and he was an architect, and the Granada was Liebenberg's first big movie theater commission. In the years that followed, he became one of the most successful movie theater architects in the country. I'll mention him again in a moment. So you had the atmospheric style. What comes next? well, you have Art Deco. This is one of the better examples of this particular style in Hennepin County, the Edina, which still exists today, even though it's much less Art Deco-y than it was at the time. We're in the 1930s now, the Great Depression. People are struggling to get by, and even if you can't afford to see a movie every once in a while, you don't necessarily want to do it in a place that reminds you, you know, in these big picture palaces, how good things used to be. So the Art Deco is this new trend of design, and it's made its way to the United States from Europe, and it's showing up in all kinds of architecture, including movie theaters. And this is where Jack Liebenberg really started making his name. He designed the Edina and a bunch of other Art Deco movie houses, including this, which may have been his masterpiece. This is the Hollywood, which still stands in Northeast Minneapolis. These are places a lot of us think of when we think of classic movie theaters. And the Twin Cities really is quite rich and was quite rich in Art Deco movie theaters, precisely because Jack Liebenberg was here and he was really good at designing them, and he was so prolific. So there's the black screen, Sophie. I'll just wrap that up. As it turned out, the Hollywood and the Edina were the last movie theater to be built in Minneapolis for quite a while. World War II came along. Nobody was building new theaters. Even if you wanted to construct one, you couldn't because of labor and raw material shortages during the war. Movies were simply not considered a national priority. But when the war ended, the local movie exhibition guys started gearing up again, and that will get us to the next part of the talk. Do we have anything we want to stop on here, Sophie?
We do, yeah. So there's been a lot of just chatter in the chat, really tracking the presentation, people who are just loving how beautiful some of these theaters are, and other theaters that they remind them of. There are a couple of questions that came through. The first one, I guess, I don't know if it's really a question, but a lot of people were talking about it. 24,000 people, 4,000 people, as far as the size of these theaters. Christy Gibson and a lot of other people asked, like, can that possibly be right? It's so much bigger than we think these theaters are.
First off, did I say 24,000?
2,400. I can't read my own writing, sorry.
2,400, 4,000, those are accurate numbers. That is how big they were. And yeah, to imagine going to a movie in a place like, especially the Minnesota, I wish I had been around when the Radio City was still here, but I wasn't. I can't imagine what it would have been like.
Oh, it's really amazing. The other question was someone just saying that it would be really interesting to know if there were interior shots of the Radio City or Minnesota theaters that you know of.
There are, and I'm sorry I didn't show them to you. It would take me a little bit to call them up, but there are some shots in the book. I know that I have at least one photo of the Capitol in St. Paul, and it's taken from, there was a stage there with an orchestra pit, and so it's taken looking out into the auditorium where the audience would be, and it gives you an idea about how immense this place was. I'm sorry I didn't include any photos in this presentation, but there definitely are pictures that do show in at least a few of these theaters what they were like at the time, and it's they're just amazing. I can't imagine what it would have been.
One more question came in while you were talking from Layla Suleiman. I wonder if people dressed up to go to the movies at that time. Was it considered a formal and exciting thing to go to the movies, or was it more casual like it is now?
Certainly not everybody, but by all means, a lot of people did consider this sort of the height of entertainment, and they would dress up. And we do have pictures that show people weren't showing up in t-shirts and baseball caps and that sort of thing. It was a different time. And I think that bleeds over into the era that we're going to talk about next as well, during the 1950s.
Good segue. I'll turn off my video and let you continue.
Okay. All right. So we've gotten through World War II. It's 1947. The war's been over for more than a year. No one has built a new movie theater in the Twin Cities for more than a decade at that point. And this is the era I'm here to talk about. The first new post-war movie theater is about to appear in the Minneapolis Twin Cities area. And think for a moment what you think that theater might have been. I'm guessing most people won't get this, but take a moment, see if you're right. The answer to the first new movie theater in the Twin Cities area after World War II is this: the Bloomington DriveIn. The Bloomington was located at East 78th Street, right on the border between Bloomington and Richfield. So I think it's basically along where 494 is now. The Twin Cities were actually a little late to the game as far as drive-in theaters went. In 1947, there were already actually about 200 drive-ins nationwide, but this was the beginning of the baby boom and suburbanization, and young families were looking for entertainment that didn't require hiring a babysitter and watching movies with your kids in the comfort of your new wood-paneled station wagon or whatever you were driving. That seemed to fit the bill. So over the next 3 years, 6 additional drive-ins popped up in the Twin Cities, and they would continue to pop up over the years to come, so that by the mid-1960s, there were a total of 18 drive-ins in the Twin Cities metro. But these were outdoor theaters. From an architectural standpoint, they weren't anything special. The fact was there hadn't been a new indoor theater built in the Twin Cities since the 1930s. So what comes next? Sophie, I'll just pause there. Any questions about drive-ins before I move on?
No questions, but just a comment that that's the only kind of theater we can go to right now, so it seems very fitting.
Unfortunately, there's only one of them left in the Twin Cities. It's the Valley High in Lake Elmo. All of the others are gone now. When I wrote the book, there were 2. There was the Cottage Grove, the Cottage Drive-In in Cottage Grove, but that's been turned into a Walmart. So just one in the Twin Cities. There are a few others in Minnesota, as far as I know. I think one in Litchfield and maybe a couple others elsewhere. But if you want to go see a drive-in movie during the pandemic, unfortunately, we don't have too many choices in Minnesota. So moving on from drive-ins, this might be a good point to make sure that I got my definitions clear for you. I'm here to talk about mid-century movie scene in the Twin Cities, but what is exactly mid-century? For our purposes, for my purposes here, I'm going to define mid-century as the period beginning specifically 1948 and ending in 1970. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who would argue with me on whether that is exactly mid-century or not. But I do think it makes sense in the context of the movie exhibition business, at least in terms of how the business worked here in the Twin Cities. And that's because I would argue that the particular architectural style that distinguishes this particular era of movie theater design played out between those years, 1948 and 1970. So these days, we tend to talk about design during this period as mid-century modern, but if you look back at how people at the time referred to the next big thing in movie theater design, you see one term popping up again and again and again, and that term is ultra modern. So that's the term I'm going to use here. In the Twin Cities, during that 2-decade plus period that I'm talking about, there were 5 ultra modern theaters that opened up, just 5. But they were really, really cool. Cool theaters that opened up, even though there were only 5 of them. And so this gets us back to where we started. The coolest of them was the Terrace. And I'm gonna, as I talk here, I'm gonna try to click through a few photographs that just give you an idea of how cool the Terrace was. As it happens, the Terrace was designed by Jack Liebenberg, the guy who had designed the Granada and the Edina and the Hollywood and all those other art deco houses. But he moved on to something different here with the Terrace. In many ways, the Terrace was the creation of two brothers, Bill and Sidney Volk. The Volk brothers had grown up on Minneapolis's north side, and they had launched their careers as movie exhibitors in the in the 1930s when they took over two existing neighborhood theaters. One of them was called the Camden in North Minneapolis. The other was the Nile in South Minneapolis. And in 1948, they opened the Twin Cities' first new post-war enclosed movie theater called the Riverview. Not the Terrace, it was the Riverview was their first theater, but it wasn't quite the Riverview that we know today, and I'll have more on that in a bit. It wasn't until 1951 that the Volks caught the movie world's attention with the opening of one of the first ultra-modern theaters in the country, and that was the Terrace. It's hard to overstate what a big deal this was when the Terrace opened. The first movie there was a Spencer Tracy Elizabeth Taylor film called Father's Little Dividend. You have to realize by 1951, when the Terrace opened, the movie theater business was in a really bad business slump. The babies of the baby boom hadn't reached their prime movie going years yet. Their parents were often cash strapped, paying off balances on their new Oldsmobiles and their Frigidaires and that type of thing. The movies being churned out by Hollywood had still not returned to their pre-war quality. They just weren't that good at this point. And then, of course, there was television. Everyone in the movie business was terrified of television. They were convinced that Americans would no longer want to watch movies in a theater when they had the option of watching their favorite TV shows on a small screen. But the Volk brothers were convinced that audiences could be lured back to the movies if they could just do it in luxury. By the way, that's the Terrace's little TV room that they built into this theater, largely out of fear that if people didn't have access to TV, they wouldn't show up in the movie theaters. So that's what the Volks gave them, a new theater. It exuded class in this new way, and they turned out to be right. The Terrace did phenomenal business during its first few months. And one thing that I like to do at this point sometimes is I don't often read quotes from other places, but this comes from Business Week magazine at the time. They wrote up a whole big article about the Terrace. And let me just read you a little bit about what Business Week said about this particular theater to give you an idea about how significant it was. So quoting, "Last May, two Minneapolis theater owners pulled a stunt that made every other exhibitor in the area decide that they had blown their lids sky high. In nearby Robbinsdale, Minnesota, William and Sidney Volk opened a movie theater that cost them close to $1 million to build. Since television seemed to have put the movie business solidly on the skids, this looked to be an elaborate way to commit suicide. Most astounding of all was the lavishness of the place. It looked more like a country club than a movie house. It had, for example, a deeply carpeted sunken lounge where a pleasant, smiling hostess would serve you a cup of coffee free. There was a separate glassed-in theater in which to watch television, which you're looking at right now. The 1,300-seat theater itself had wide, comfortable seats with plenty of room between rows and the aisles. All of this and more any patron could get for top admission price of 60 cents. By last week, the other exhibitors had decided that the Volk brothers were far from crazy. They were doing a booming business, such as most theater owners hadn't seen since the war. From that fact, they draw a hopeful moral. Do things right, and the box office will take care of itself." So that's what Business Week thought of the Terrace and how significant it was in the movie business at that time. Movie people from around the country, they flocked to Robbinsdale to see for themselves what the Volks had done. And in the process, the Terrace became, I guess you would call it sort of a template. It demonstrated to others in the movie exhibition business that, hey, there is a way out of our troubles in the movie industry, even if we are in a slump. But if we can pull ourselves out of this if we just do things right. So the Terrace is the first and the greatest example of the ultra-modern theater design, maybe in the entire country, but certainly in the Twin Cities. And there's where you get the title of the exhibit, America's Finest Theater. So the Terrace wasn't alone. You have to remember that. There were 4 other ultra-moderns, and they opened in the metro area not long after that, 3 in Hennepin County, 1 in Ramsey County. And while they weren't quite on the Terrace's level, they were special in their own right. We'll get to those in a moment. Sophie, is there anything we need to cover before I move on?
Yeah, well, so there were a lot of just kind of factual questions about the Terrace, but we have enough Terrace experts here that many of them have been answered by other people on the call. But I did think I'd pass one along because I wondered if, I have 2 questions actually that I'll pass along because I wonder if you have more to say about this. So someone just asked where the Terrace was, and that question has been answered factually, but where the address was. But I wonder if you can say more about where it was kind of like in the Robbinsdale of its age, like what was around it. Or maybe you know or don't know.
Well, to tell you the truth, I'm not I can't remember what exactly was right around it, but what really did make this place special, and it's hard to imagine now, I think, if you go to the High V, or even before the Terrace was demolished, if you went there and looked around, you could no longer get the sense of what a sort of special piece of real estate it was at the time, because there was no strip mall in front of it or anything like this. It was up on this rise on this hill that looked out, and I believe, and maybe David can correct me if I'm wrong, because I am not a Robbinsdale expert, but there is a lake off in the background. And so I believe that's a big reason why Jack Liebenberg designed it the way he did, with these huge picture windows that were on that side of the lobby that allowed people, you could just stand there, as far as I know, and look out on what was, at least for a while, a beautiful vista before the area started filling in. And as I said, there was eventually a strip mall that was there. That is the thing that hits me, even though I wasn't around at the time it was built, that seems to be to me from the descriptions I've seen, that's what made, that's the other thing that made this theater so special, is just the prime real estate.
Yeah, and David did confirm what you were saying. He says, yes, Crystal Lake was seen from the sunken lobby before the Terrace Mall was built. One other question was whether this theater was segregated, as far as you know, racially segregated?
I write about racial segregation in the movie exhibition business here in the Twin Cities, but I found nothing to suggest that the type of segregation that did exist in the Twin Cities extended into the Terrace era, into the post-war era. There were definitely some theaters in the Twin Cities that were known as segregated houses into probably the 1930s. I can think of a couple that were in St. Paul. I believe, if I remember correctly, in my book, I talk about, I'm pretty sure that the Pantages was segregated as well. But this was a little bit earlier period, at least in the Twin Cities, as far as where that came into play. It was definitely, as far as I know, phased out by the 1950s.
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Let's continue.
Okay. All right. So we've talked about the first of the ultramoderns, the Terrace. The next one I've already mentioned, and it's the Riverview, which, if you're not aware, probably most of you are, it's still standing and still showing movies in South Minneapolis. When the Riverview opened in 1948, it wasn't all that special architecturally, but in 1956, the Volks brothers, they've now had this success with the Terrace. They decided to put the lessons they learned there at the Terrace to work at the Riverview. So again, they hired Jack Liebenberg and he designs the remodel, and what he comes up with is, again, all ultra modern. The lobby looks like a mid-century modern living room with marble coffee tables and imported lamps and potted plants and floral print carpeting, like you can see in this photograph. There was also a separate TV lounge, just like in the Terrace. The Volks now had 2 ultramodern theaters, and they were both doing gangbuster business. Thing was, it wasn't cheap to build these theaters. The Volks were taking quite a gamble when they were building them. And so if you're going to build them, you have to have some money, and that might explain why after these 2, there were only 3 other ultramoderns that were built in the next decade. There's one other photograph with that, including that wonderful carpeting there at the Riverview. Sophie, do we need to stop after the Riverview, or should we move on to the next one?
Actually, there was a question that came in at the end of the last round of questions that I missed, so I'll ask you that one. This is from Jay Pasca. He says, it seems like a lot of the Liebenberg and Kaplan theater designs had a sloped floor and seating in the front, and then what we would now call stadium seating in the back. Was that unique to those architects, or were similar theater designs from other architects elsewhere? I missed a word there, but I think you understood the question.
Yeah, I think you're right. Certainly not all of the Jack Liebenberg theaters had the stadium seating. I don't think that term was used at the time. But obviously, if you go to the Riverview right now, you have the more sloped, as you said, seats in the front, and then in the back, they go up like that. And I can't, maybe David can remind me, I can't remember whether the Terrace would have been described that way or not, whether it had the back stadium seating. I do believe that Liebenberg, well, I'm sure he designed other theaters that had that steep slope seating, but I can't speak to whether other architects around the country were doing that at the same time. My sense is that that architects who were in this business and had this specialty watched each other and picked up tips from each other and trends. And so I'm guessing that this was something that was developing during that period. What's interesting is a decade or 2 after this, then it sort of goes back to something where you have these cheap theaters that nobody would put that extra money into building something like that. So they disappeared for a while. But that would be my answer to that.
Right. And David has chimed in to say, yes, the Terrace was sloped all the way from front to back.
Okay. All right. Okay. So we've got those 2 Volk theaters that were the first 2 of the ultramoderns. We have 3 others. Next one was the Cooper. And this is probably one of the most beloved theaters in Twin Cities movie theater history. At least that's the sense I get when I talk to people and tell them that I wrote a book about movie theaters in Minneapolis and St. Paul. You know, more often than not, the Cooper comes up. People remember this thing. They're very fond of it. And I think for good reason. The Cooper opened in St. Louis Park in 1962. It was one of 3 nearly identical Coopers in the United States. The other 2 were in Omaha and Denver. The St. Louis Park Cooper was this big orange round thing that you can see right there, and it was built especially to show Cinerama films. These were films that were projected on this big 105-foot curved screen. It was really an experience to go see a Cinerama film in a theater that was built to show them. The Cooper was snazzy and in a very definitely ultra-modern way. It's had this big 3,000 square foot lobby. It was done up in walnut paneling and black brick and burnt orange furnishings and blue acoustic tiles on the ceiling. Its auditorium had, 1,000 really comfortable seats done up in blue mohair. People loved this theater, and they still love it. Unfortunately, it's just a memory now. It was demolished in 1992. I'll just say that you might be wondering this particular photograph. I've always liked this one. This was actually taken at the premiere of the movie Airport. I think it was 1970, 1971. And they thought it would be cool to land a plane, a small plane next to the Cooper for the Airport premiere. And that's what that one is about. So Sophie, anything on the Cooper?
Nothing there.
Okay. Well, let's keep moving then. The next Twin Cities theater that fell into the ultra-modern category was this one. It's called the Southtown, and it was located in a shopping mall parking lot near I-494 and Penn Avenue South in Bloomington. It opened 2 years after the Cooper in 1964. As I mentioned, these ultramoderns were expensive, so you had to have deep pockets if you wanted to build one. And the guy who built the Southtown definitely had deeper pockets than most people. His name was Ted Mann. And by the 1960s, Ted Mann was by far the most successful showman in the Twin Cities movie business. But when Ted Mann built his movie theater empire, he did it by acquiring existing theaters. The Southtown was the first one he ever built from scratch. And the ads billed it in sort of very ultra modern ways as your comfort theater of tomorrow. Its lobby had futuristic red box office. It's had floor to ceiling red draperies that are sort of suggested by that photograph there. It had this really sort of fun oval shaped concession stand. The auditorium had rows of these rocker back seats, and so the patrons could stretch out there, which was something fairly new and described as living room comfort. In the Southtown, it survived until 1995, and then it was torn down. So that's the Southtown, the fourth of the five. Anything there, Sophie?
One question from Rita: were those ashtrays on the backs of the seats, or were they white?
That's quite possible. That has never occurred to me. I do know that a number of theaters from this period did have make accommodations for smokers. I believe the Cooper was one of them. But I can't tell you for sure. I think that's a really good guess, though. This would have been a period that accommodations would have been made for smokers. It was not uncommon to have that sort of foggy air that you had to look through to get to the picture on the screen.
Dress up and go smoke in a theater.
There you go.
All right.
All right. The last of the Twin Cities ultramoderns was built not in Hennepin County, but in Ramsey County in Roseville, where I grew up, where I currently live, actually. And it was the only one that was actually attached to a shopping mall. And it was this one. This was the Harmar 1 and 2. And it was the far end of Harmar Mall, which is still around somehow. It opened in 1970, and it basically marked the last hurrah of the ultramodern theater period in the Twin Cities. So like the Southtown, it was built by Ted Mann, but unlike the Southtown, which was originally a single theater, the Harmar had 2 screens. It was a 2-screen cinema, and this was a pretty new and big deal at that particular time. At the same time, both of its auditoriums were big and comfortable and ultra modern ways. They had these, again, sort of like the Southtown, these matching floor to ceiling draperies. In the Harmar 1, they were gold, and then the Harmar 2, they were blue. Its lobby was really, really wonderful. It had Venetian glass chandeliers. It had this molded fiberglass box office. It had bubbling in the windows there. It had bubbling fountains that gave the place this glitzy aura. It created an experience that few theaters in the country would have had after this period. This was that guy there in the corner is actually laying the carpeting, I believe. This is before the theater actually opened up in 1970. Harmar held on until 2006, and that's when it was made obsolete by a big megaplex that was less than a mile away near in Rosedale Mall. It's now a Staples office supply store. So that was the last of the ultramoderns in the Twin Cities. Anything there, Sophie?
None there.
Okay. That's actually where I saw many of the movies when I was a kid. So my movie memories are attached to the Harmar in many ways. And so that was the end of the ultra-modern era in the Twin Cities movie-going scene. It started with the Terrace, ended with the Harmar. And just so you know, what you might be wondering what came next. And unfortunately, the answer is not very pretty. In the late 1960s and the early 1970s, the industry switched to a new business model. And this was one that sought to, squeeze every penny of profit by, squeezing moviegoers into these really ugly multiplexes. That was the term that was used at the time. And they had these nondescript sort of shoebox rectangular auditoriums. And this was the first multiplex in the Twin Cities. It was called the Cinema 1 and 2, opened in 1966. It was adjacent to the Southdale Shopping Center in Edina. And in fact, it pretty soon after it opened was renamed the Southdale. The Cinema 1 and 2 was soon followed by a slew of other ever larger multiplexes in the metro area. And actually the trend eventually consumed all but one of those big, beautiful ultramoderns that we've been talking about. In 1975, the Cooper's owners built a little 300 seat appendage alongside that big round orange thing, and they called it the Cooper Cameo. So at that point, the Cooper was actually a 2-theater complex. 2 years after that, the Harmar 1 was split in half, which basically turned this duplex into a triplex. And then a few years after that, the Harmar added 8 of these tiny shoebox things, shoebox auditoriums, and what had been an adjacent retail space. So the Harmar was, I guess you would call it an 11-plex at that point, basically the most screens in one area in the entire Twin Cities. In 1980, the Southtown was subdivided into 2 auditoriums, and then in 1988, the Terrace, it finally succumbed, and it was carved into little viewing rooms as well. So that's what the Cinema 1 and the Cinema 2 started. It started this multiplexing of the Twin Cities movie business, and so we can blame the Cinema 1 and the Cinema 2, the Southdale, for starting us down that path. Anything there, Sophie?
A question from Alex Weston: was the Cinema 1 and 2 eventually known as the Yorktown, or was that a different?
That would have been a different theater. I can look it up in a moment, but yeah, they were, I am almost certain those were 2 different theaters. Yeah. So basically, one of the ultramoderns has survived, and that, of course, is the Riverview. No one somehow had the bad sense to carve this one up. It still has its one screen and its backlit proscenium and its rear section stadium seating and its way cool lobby. If you ever go to see a movie there, and you should, you'll be transported back in another time, to the 1950s and 1960s when, there was the question about, did people dress up? And I think we showed a picture, at least one, from the lobby of the Riverview, where, yeah, people were putting on shirts and ties. They were putting on sweater sets or whatnot because they wanted to watch a movie and have an experience, watch it in a building that was designed to look and feel, like in a comic age living room or a country club. You know, the big megaplexes where we go to see movies these days, they're nice. They have comfortable seats and stadium seating and good sight lines and concession stands that, you know, they sell a lot more than just popcorn and candy and soda pop. They have all those things, but you know, they lack the mid-century cool that these ultra moderns had, and we're really lucky that we still have one of them. So that's sort of the story of the this forgotten period of the ultra moderns, and it didn't last long. It was only a couple decades, but it did give us some of the most memorable movie theaters that ever existed in the Twin Cities. And you know, I'm just happy that the Riverview still exists. I'm happy that the Hennepin History Museum has this exhibit that's going to allow people to experience even just a little bit of what it was like during that period. And I'm happy that Sophie, you invited me to be here and talk about it. And if we're at a point where we can have a discussion or more questions, that would be great. But thank you.
Thank you, Dave. This has been so great. So one question is whether you have, so we are in for another change in movies coming up, and what do you see for the future of movie theaters in the Twin Cities?
Oh man. Okay, I'm going to preface this by saying I wrote this book about 10 years ago, and I cannot claim to be keeping up on industry trends as much as I should have. You know, to give you an idea, when I wrote the book, we were still in the early phases of digital film exhibition. And so a number of the people who were in the business, who owned movie theaters, ran movie theaters, were still sort of scared of what was going to be happening, whether they were going to be able to afford the new technology that they saw coming down the road. And obviously that has developed in the years since this book was published. It really would be only a guess on my part, and I really can't claim to be any sort of expert, but as far as I can tell, we're now in another sort of similar gray area for movie exhibitors, having to do with the competition that comes from you know, the digital realm and Netflix and these other producers of content that are now making movies and not always even taking them to the theaters. So I think it's you know, on top of the fact that we've got these huge companies like AMC that are trying to figure out how they're navigating this particular moment in time with coronavirus, what they're going to end up looking like after all this is done, whether the movie going public, which is sort of getting used to perhaps going without the experience of seeing a movie in a theater. I think if I were in the movie exhibition business, I'd be pretty scared. At the same time, there have been a number of these periods over the years where it's looked scary to the exhibitors, and somehow this business, this art form survives and keeps going, sometimes stronger than it was before. But I apologize for not having a great answer there, but it is sort of a wait and see.
It's a hard question. I've got a couple other questions here, one from Rita and one from Jackie Schlucher, but I see that Dave Leonhardt has his hand raised, so I'm going to turn it over to David Leonhardt from the Terrace Legacy Project for a second.
Thanks. I just wanted to go on with the question about the future of the movie industry. I've spoken to a lot of independent movie theaters, and like Dave said, a lot of them are nervous about what the future holds for them, especially with the onset of the streaming and the movies that are coming directly to streaming now instead of going into the theaters. And that's the reason, you know, especially with the pandemic in place, that's the reason why so many of them are selling now concessions and popcorn on the weekends. Places like the Riverview are now selling a lot more merchandise. They're all trying to raise money literally just to, you know, keep the doors open. So while the future is so murky, especially with new movies not being released till who knows when at this point, I just want to, you know, I just really want to encourage people to visit your local independently owned theaters, and just buy a bag of popcorn, you know, buy pop. People talk about how much, you know, the popcorn and pop costs at a movie theater, but that's really where they make their money, and that's where, you know, their revenue is to keep the doors open and to keep their people employed. So I just wanted to, you know, throw that out there to make sure that, you know, support them as often as you can. And the Riverview is selling popcorn today until I believe 7 o'clock. I'm going down there after this is done to pick some up. So I encourage a lot of people to do so as well.
They are, and it's one of my big regrets of planning this is that they start selling popcorn at 2 p.m. and we started at 2 p.m. So nobody was able to go get their popcorn before the talk, but you can
I noticed that.
post-talk popcorn. All right, well, we've got a little time left. I don't see any other hands raised, but I'll ask these questions from Rita and Jackie, and then we'll end with the question from Rob Northrup. So Rita and a couple other people were wondering, what about some of the smaller theaters like the Highland Park? Do you have anything to say about those?
All I can say is we're lucky we still have them. So there's the Riverview, obviously, the Highland in Highland Park, St. Paul, the Grand View in St. Paul as well. So those are the two in the St. Paul city limits that actually have basically been kept alive through subsidies by the city that has looked for ways to keep these theaters open. The other one that comes to mind is the Heights, which is just a wonderful little theater in Columbia Heights. If you haven't been there, give that a shot as well. They are, you know, they are just such different experiences from going to the new big megaplexes that are around the Twin Cities now. Whenever I can, I will go to these smaller theaters. My personal favorite is the Heights. If you're not familiar with it, they have a concert organ there and do before the shows. They'll have an organist come in and do a concert before that you can take part in. It's just a real throwback experience. The Highland and the Grand View aren't quite the experiences they were back in the day, because back in, I think it was the 1970s, they were basically twinned so that the upper areas, the balconies were turned into these smaller viewing rooms. So it's not quite as grand as it was back in the 1930s or so. The other one I forgot to mention, obviously, the Uptown in the Uptown area, still going. If you get a chance, once the movies get back running again, and you look in the newspaper or wherever you get your movie listings, and there's an opportunity to see the movie that you want to see in one of these theaters, please go to them, because they're just, I think, better experiences, and also you're helping local entrepreneurs, local business people keep these things going, and they're the ones that are managing to keep these theaters, these buildings alive, saving them from the wrecking balls. And we've lost way too many of them already, and anything you can do to help them would be great.
All right, second to last question is probably pretty short. It's a question from Jackie Schluter, who's wondering, were Southdale and Brookdale by the same architect?
So we're talking about the malls themselves, or are we talking about the theaters? Can you tell? Are we?
I have now lost it. Were the Southdale and Brookdale theaters built by the same architect?
You know, My guess is yes, but to tell you the truth, these would have been theaters, if I'm not mistaken, that would have fallen into the multiplex era. And because I really hated them, I didn't look into who were the people responsible for designing these things. They were not really all that special. So my guess is that any number of people could have designed them. The fact that I think all the Dales maybe at that point were still owned by the Dayton Hudson Company. It's possible that one architect worked on all of them, but I'm afraid I can't say for sure.
Yeah. All right, last question. This was actually asked earlier in the chat by Rob Northrup, wondering how you got into studying the history of movie theaters.
I could go on a long way, but I'll try to keep it short.
In a paragraph or less.
Yeah. Basically, the publisher of Minnesota Historical Society Press came to me and said that he was aware of this collection that was down in the bowels of the Minnesota History Center. This collection that had been put together by two researchers at the Historical Society over the years, and they had, I think there were more than 24 of these boxes, and it was all this research that had been done on movie theaters that were built before the 1930s. And it was just this amazing collection. He wanted to know, I had written a couple books for the press, and he wanted to know whether I'd be interested in seeing if I could turn it into something. And I said, sure, I'll look. And I went through all these boxes, and I was just amazed at the amount of material they had put together. But I also had a pretty good idea that if we were going to try to do a book that was only about movie theaters through the 1920s, there wasn't going to be much of a market for that. So I went to Greg and suggested, how about if we try to track it from the very beginning to the present? And he bit, and I did not have any particular expertise in this particular subject area at that time, but I spent the next 2 years working on it, and that's how it came about.
Very nice. And that was a nice segue actually to a reminder to myself. There was the question earlier about the interior shots of the Radio City Theater, and our archivist, Michelle Hagan, who's on the call, texted me with a picture she found on the Minnesota Historical Society website of the interior. So for those of you who want to keep doing your own research after this, you could search around on their website and you'll find some shots. All right, well, I'll wrap things up by just saying thank you to everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this event. Thank you to Dave Kenney for such a great presentation. And this was a free event. We were really glad to be able to make it free so that so many of you could attend, and that's thanks to our members. So that's all from us. Thank you once again. I see a lot coming up in the chat about just how much people appreciated this talk, Dave. Do you have any final words before we sign out?
Go see a movie as soon as you can.
It's a great one. Please do. All right, everyone, I'm ending the call. Take care. Bye.